Hey, what's going on YouTube? Or Storm here with another deck profile today. This is going to be a bit of a two-part. First, I'm going to talk about how to, and then I'm going to play this particular deck. In this case, it's different dimension demons, or DDDs as they're commonly referred to. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to play the deck because it's a little bit different than other pendulum decks that we've seen. But obviously, first I'm going to a little bit of background. Now, if you don't know what different dimension demons or DDDs are, they are a pendulum-based archetype used by one of the main characters in the Arc 5 anime. They're used by Reggie or Declan if you're talking about the dub. So basically, the interesting thing about which I'm going to probably talk a little bit more about Arc 5 in another video. But the interesting thing about this deck is that obviously one of the things Reggie is known for is using all three summoning mechanics: Fusion, XYZ, and Synchro. And obviously he also has pendulums as well. So it's interesting that the interesting about the deck is having to integrate all of these things together and trying to get to a coherent strategy. So the first thing you need to realize about different dimension or DDDs is that it is a combo-oriented deck. So, obviously playing anything more than 40 cards in a combo-based deck is no bueno. Especially in a deck like this, like you've got to play triple upstart and cards like Trade-In because you've got like 5 level 8s and they're searchable via this Hellgate card. You've got and even a Lore of Darkness. Like you have to run a lot of draw power in a deck like this. And because you've got so many strategies going together, you're necessarily going to brick a little bit more on occasion. Although I think with this particular build, I've been able to kind of keep it reasonably consistent. It's by no means perfect because as a combo-based deck, you're necessarily going to brick more than you should. Nevertheless, I think this is a pretty decently consistent build, so I'm going to go into the deck profile and talk a little bit. Now, with that out of the way, I'll talk a little bit about that. First, 3 copies of DDD Lilith. Lilith is basically sort of like a lot of the DDD cards either add cards from hand to graveyard, or most of them, though, they special summon something from the graveyard. What Lilith does is when she's normal or special summoned, she will add a DDD monster from your graveyard and add it to your hand, or add a pendulum monster from your extra deck to your hand. So it's pretty key because a lot of times you're going to be fusing with your Kepler when you've summoned it on the field. And a lot of times this is going to be the primary. You're going to be fusing with it, so you can just add Kepler back to your hand. Kepler's a pretty important part of the strategy, which I'm going to get to that. But it's also pretty much your only really high-end scale, as well as being a good searcher. So obviously, looping this guy back to your hand from the extra deck is pretty dang nice. 2 copies of DD Night Howling. This is sort of like much like I said previously, a lot of the cards in this deck are Wolf Bark, so when this card is normal summon, it is also a tuner. It will special summon a DD monster from your graveyard, but its attack and defense becomes 0, and you take 1,000 damage if it's destroyed. So if you drop this, you special summon your opponent, change torrential, you're going to take 1,000 life. But this card, basically, what you're using with this is you're going to probably use it with bring Lilith back, add something back, and then you're going to probably synchro up for Gale King Alexander most of the time. You can also make Chaos King Archfiend. Another card I think I've ran in some builds is a Dark Highlander. It's not the most viable card, but definitely with a few especially because in the future we are going to be getting some more synchro decks in TCG. We've got Gradles coming out. But I don't think synchroing's the primary thing with Gradles. It's stealing monsters. But you've also got Speedroids, which make synchros pretty consistently as well. So being able to stop synchro summoning is pretty nice, especially because most of the time this deck's not primary mechanic is mostly making fusions. The XYZs outside of Kali Yuga aren't spectacular, but most of the time you're going to be making the fusions. It's where a lot of the power plays are at. And then 1 copy of DD Swirl Slime. There's another, I only like one of this card, mostly because of its graveyard effect. Basically, it's sort of like a polymerization from your hand. You can activate it in hand and pitch another DD monster from your hand and summon a fusion monster from your extra deck. The main reason you don't want to... Now, I've seen some of the OCG lists. They run this card, and I believe the card is called Necro Slime. I believe it's called, yeah. It's sort of like a... Swirl Slime is like a poly, whereas Necro Slime is like a Miracle Fusion when it's in the graveyard. So a lot of the OCG lists run these cards at 3. I just don't personally. I'm not the biggest fan of Necro Slime because I want to keep my DD monsters in the graveyard so I can recycle them back and keep cycling Wolf Barking them back. Because there's not really a lot of this deck doesn't have a lot of built-in ways to cycle cards back into the from the banish zone. So I prefer to actually have my cards, in the graveyard to be cycled back unless I'm in a really bad position. That's the reason I don't like Necro Slime. And you really don't want more than one copy of Swirl Slime because you have Swamp King to do a lot of your fusing anyways. So next, 2 copies of DDD Conquest King Kaiser. Now, this card in paper theory doesn't sound good until you get to the bottom part of the text. Basically, if this card's Pendulum Summon, all your face-up cards your opponent controls are negated. So basically, it still can be bottomless when it's Pendulum Summon, but if your opponent has a bunch of face-up floodgates, you just drop this, and it's just bam, everything's turned off until the end of the turn. And if it's Pendulum Summon, it sort of has this Fire Fist Bear effect. You can blow up to 2 cards in your spell and trap zone. Most of the time, those are going to be your Covenants, and it can attack as many times as you blow up. So it's basically an OTK on its own because 328 is well over 8k of damage. This deck can OTK fairly easily through multiple Upstart Goblins, and this card is one of the main reasons why. It's also level 7, which means among the ranks you'll be making, 7 and 8 are probably the most consistent ones, and most of the time, and it can make, your big, if you really need to go into Big Eye, you can with this card. But most of the time, you're going to be using it for OTKing. Then the next card is 2 DD Astronomer Galley. Some DDD players don't even run this card because unlike, Kepler, you have plenty of, low-level scales aren't really an issue. It's sort of the same issue Odd Eyes has, except Odd Eyes doesn't have a lot of high-level scales. Like outside of Dragon Pit Magician and Joker, you don't have a lot of low. Well, DDDs have the same problem. Like the only high scale they have is Kepler. So not that that's really a total problem, but this card's basically, it's a low scale. But the main reason I like it is its hand effect. You can pitch it from your hand to bounce a Covenant, or in this case, it's called a Dark Contract here in the TCG. You pitch it from your hand. You can bounce a DD monster you control, or card you control, back to your hand, or a Covenant, or a Dark Contract, sorry. Basically, what I like about this is it allows you to kind of reset your scales, which is one of the biggest things with this deck. If you'll notice something about Kepler and Galilei, their biggest problem, the biggest things with these 2 cards is that their scales change every standby phase. So Kepler's scale will go down and Galilei's scale will go up. So what this card allows you to do is just bounce them back and then put them back and then get your scales reset to the proper level, which is really what matters. And Kepler can do that as well when it's normal summon. That's another effect it has, but we'll get. So speaking of Kepler, Kepler's Pendulum isn't really that relevant. The main thing is when it's normal or special summon, it can do 2 things. It can target a DDD card you control, which means in the Pendulum Zone, return it to your hand. The main thing it does is it adds 1 Dark Contract card from deck to the hand. Dark Contracts are pretty key to the deck. I mean, you have a Searcher, you have a Miracle Fusion, you have a Royal Decree, a card that pops cards. I mean, they're pretty key to this deck's strategy. They're kind of sort of like the deck's greatest strength, but also kind of the deck's greatest weakness. So, you kind of have to roll the punches a bit with that. But nevertheless, this card is a must-have play at 3. It's your only real high scale. It's a Searcher for a lot of your Searcher. And it's just a really good card. It's also summonable off of 1-for-1, so that's obviously why it's in here. 3 copies of DDD Cruel King Hell Armageddon. This is basically like your beefy beater. Its Pendulum effect is you can target a DD monster you control and like an 800 attack. A lot of times when I Pendulum Summon Kaiser, and I'll usually have this in the Pendulum Zone, I'll just buff it up to make sure it gets it can get over bigger threats. It's also a key thing, it's a level 8, so you can ditch it with Trade-In. Most of the time this card just gets pitched with Trade-In, and I'll just Wolf Bark it back. That's why it's in here at 3. And then DD next 2 copies of King Abyss Ragnarok. This card is very, very good, but I don't really feel like I need more than 2. Basic thing is this card is it has a pendulum effect that when a card is it's sort of like a lot like the fusion and synchro. When a DDD monster special summon, when it's in the pendulum zone, your opponent takes half battle damage, but you can special summon and you take damage. But in this deck, you have cards like D-Arc that reverse burn damage, or cards like Leonidas that just make you immune to burn damage, to taking damage. So in theory, this deck has a pretty decent Red Eyes matchup because they can't burn you. They can't, as long as this card or this is out, they can't hit you with Red Eyes Flare Metal will actually heal you instead of burning you, which is kind of I remember I ran into Red Eye's player on Salvation. He's like, that's mean because I had the arc out, and he kept giving me life every time I activated effect. It's really dumb. Speaking of Leonidas, and last monsters, there's 3 copies of Leonidas. Leonidas is a must play at 3. The main point of this card is it's there to keep you from taking damage. As long as when you take damage from a card effect, except during damage step, you can special summon it from your hand, and you'll gain life equal to the damage you took. So the main thing is your dark contracts all inflict damage to you on the standby phase. That's what Leonidas is there for. As long as it's on the field, you cannot take damage. So it's pretty nice that you have like a little bit of an insurance policy, because obviously the dark contrasts are kind of the deck's strength, but they're also the deck's greatest weakness, so you kind of have to deal with a little bit of that. Now for the spells, it's pretty spell heavy. 1 copy of Allure of Darkness, you're playing an all dark deck, pretty self-explanatory. 1 copy of Rakeki, mostly just to clear the board to make our big pushes. 2 copies of MST. This deck tends not to like back row, and I really don't want to run multiple copies of Seal Mistake because I feel like it would clog quite a bit. So I feel like the 2 MSTs are kind of like the optimal thing. I typically run 2 MSTs on a lot of my builds, or most decks. Now we're getting to our dark contracts. 3 copies of Hellgate. Hellgate is your searcher. You can activate it, and it'll once per turn you can search out during your main phase. You can search a DDD monster from your deck. It's like a searcher, and like all the dark contract cards, you take 1,000 damage every standby phase. 2 copies of Dark Contract with the Swamp King. This is basically like a continuous miracle fusion. You can fusion summon 1 fiend type fusion monster from your extra deck. All DDD fusions are fiend types, so naturally, I can't think of. There's probably other fiend type fusions you could make with this, but basically it's like a sort of like a continuous miracle fusion / poly, because you use cards from your hand, and you can also banish from your graveyard. It's a pretty good card. I don't really want to run. I think it would clog quite a bit at more than 2. I've never found myself needing the 3rd one in testing. 1 copy of 1 for 1. Kind of speaks for itself. Your primary best monster in the deck is a level 1, so 1 for 1 obviously makes sense. 2 copies of Trade-In. I only run 5 targets, so like 2 to 5 is kind of good Yu-Gi-Oh ratios usually. And last 3 spells, 3 copies of Upstart Goblin. Like I said, it's a combo-based deck. You want to thin out your deck as much as possible, so this makes sure you get to your combo pieces, and it allows you to keep thinning out your deck and making sure you get to what you need. Now for the traps, 1 copy of a Dark Contract, the Mistaken Seal. This is basically like a searchable Royal Decree. If you control once per turn, if you control a DD monster, you can negate other trap cards on the effects on the field. Once resolved, this effect remains even this card leaves the field. So it won't resolve, obviously, if they instantly space it, but if it sits on the board, they activate it, and they do some kind of thing, and they draw some kind of way to destroy it, the effect still stays in the field even if this card goes. So unless it's instantly spaced, I believe it will still resolve its effects. So you have to think about that. 1 copy of Dark Contract with the Valkyrie. Now this card has 2 effects. You can send a DDD or Dark Contract card from your hand to the graveyard, then target 1 card of the field and destroy it, and on your opponent's turn, your fiend type monsters gain 1,000 attack. And much like the other Covenant Dark Contract, you take 1,000 damage. 2 copies of DDD Resource Management. This is an incredibly potent card for bouncing around a lot of annoying spells and traps. Basically, you can shuffle monsters into the deck, 3 DD cards total, monsters from your hand, graveyard, or near Pendulum Zone. So basically, if you have monsters, it's sort of like, think of it like a Magic Mallet, sort of. You recycle 3 DDD monsters from anywhere from your hand, field, or graveyard, then add 2 to your hand. A lot of times I use this card to bounce around back row, or when I've got a bad hand, it's sort of like it allows me to get the ball rolling if I open badly. It's a really good card, and I wouldn't run it at more than 2, but I've really liked the card. And lastly, 1 Torrential Tribute. I feel like Torrential is probably one of the most powerful one-of trap cards right now. I feel like of the 1-ofs to run, since I feel like this was the safest one to run, I feel like Torrentials is obviously in the future we have Gradles and Magispectors coming out, so it's not going to be as good as it is currently, but currently it's one of the better 1-ofs you could be running. Now for the extra deck, 2 copies of DDD Blaze King Temujin. Basically, this is much like a lot of my opponents said that this deck is full of Wolf Barks, and that's kind of what you'll get. Basically, if another DDD monster special summons to your side of the field, while you control this card, you can special summon a DDD monster from your graveyard, but you can only use it once per turn. If it's destroyed by a card effect, you can recycle one of your Dark Contract cards from your graveyard, which is pretty nice. I've actually used the effect quite a bit. A lot of times I will, pop pitch one with with Valkyrie, and then I'll recycle it back when my Temujin bites the dust. And lastly, 2 copies of DDD Oracle King D-Arc. D-Arc is basically like your life point. It reverses all burn damage to healing damage. Basically, every time you would take damage from a Covenant, you will gain damage and you will gain life points instead. So this card is obviously pretty potent to the strategy. You don't always want to make this say first turn if you have a bunch of contracts up, but you definitely want to have this on the field in a lot of mid-game situations, especially. And then 2 copies of DDD Wave Oblivion, or we'll call them DDD Wave Ragnarok. Basically, when this card declares an attack, you can, it's sort of think of it like a Fright for Bear, but better. Basically, when it declares an attack, you can return one DD or Dark Contract you control to the hand and equip a monster your opponent controls, except the card this is battling. Now, they have to control multiple monsters in order to resolve this effect. Now, it will also gain attack equal to that monster. So your opponent can a little bit easily play around this if they only summon one monster. Like if you're playing at Shaddolls, which I've done testing and I cannot beat Shaddolls. Shaddolls are by far this deck's worst matchup, and because you're always going into your extra deck. So, and it's just Construct's just a lot more difficult to deal with this deck than I originally thought. But basically, this snatches a monster, and they obviously have to control 2 monsters in order to resolve the effect. But you can just snatch their biggest. You can attack one of their monsters, snatch the biggest one, and on top of that, you're getting to bounce one of your Covenant cards to either protect your life points or even bounce one of your Pendulums and put it back on their main phase too. There's a lot of things you can really, and the fact that it just snatches a monster is just obviously will always be good no matter what kind of format we're in. Now for the Synchros, 1 copy of Chaos King Archfiend. What I like about this card is when my opponent puts some beefy monster on the board with low defense, I can attack with this, and it'll switch attack of all their monsters and defense of all their monsters until the end of the battle phase. So basically, if they have some beefy monster out, like I'll just swing with this, and they'll end up taking a lot more damage than they normally would. I find it to be a pretty good card. There are some builds I also play Dark Highlander, like I mentioned earlier, but it's up to you whether you want to run it or not. 2 copies of DDD Gale King Alexander. I do find myself making the second one often. Basically, this is another Wolfbark, except it's a bit different. When a DDD monster is normal or special summon, you can target a level 4 or lower and special summon it back. So basically, this can bring your Lilith back after you've gone through your... And it also activates when a monster's normal summon, so you can, you normal summon this, you can special summon a Night Howling from your graveyard and then bring out another Synchro monster. So it's a pretty decent card. I find myself bringing it out pretty often. Now for the XYZs, 1 Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga is by far one of the best archetype-specific monsters I think I've seen in a long time. And it requires 2 level 8 DD monsters, so you're going to make it obviously with Hell Armageddon and Ragnarok. So its first effect is when this card is Exceed summoned after it hits the board. For the rest of the turn, other effects or cards on the field and cannot be activated. Also, their effects are negated. So when this hits the board, it's basically like an S0, a Star Eater S, or like a Star Eater basically, and everything gets negated. So they can't, nothing for the rest of the turn, and it's even stronger because they cannot activate anything the rest of the turn. Also, it has 2 effects for detaching an XYZ material. One is that it's a heavy storm, and the second is that it can recycle a Dark Contract spell and trap from your. You can set a Dark Contract spell trap from your graveyard to your field. So basically, you can it's really powerful card. A negation when it hits the board, a heavy storm, and it's pretty potent for the deck strategy. 2 copies of DDD Wave King Kaiser. I'm kind of a bit iffy on this card. I feel like you don't make it too often, but usually only when I summon 2 Liliths. But its effect basically reads, during either player's turn, you can detach an Exceed material. At the end of the battle phase, you special summon DDD monsters equal to the ones that are destroyed. So if you run into it, ram yourself into a Mirror Force, and you lose 4 monsters with this out, you can basically special summon them all back, but you'll take 1,000 from this effect during the next standby phase for each one. Now, most of the time it's not an issue if you have a D-Arc, you bring a D-Arc back and it sits on the board for a turn, or you have a Leonidas to heal your damage, barring the fact it will kill you. So, like, I really like the cards. In theory, seems pretty good. I mean, I don't make rank 4s too often in this deck, but I find it to be pretty decent. One copy of Divine Dragon Knight Felgrand. You could theoretically just run the second Kali Yuga, but I find that Kali Yuga is basically like a win condition when it hits the field. But like, I kind of like having the option to make Felgrand, because I feel like Felgrand is still a really powerful, potent card. If you get it out and your opponent is behind, they really have a lot of trouble dealing with it, because it can basically negate anything they do. And on top of that, it's immune to a lot of spells and traps that are, I mean, with Regeki and Dark Hole, you know, Dark Hole legal at 2 and Regeki legal, having a card that can make itself immune to those is pretty nice. Then one copy of, there's only 2 rank 7s, one copy of Flare Metal Dragon. I find that if you can make rank 7s, you probably need to play this card, because you basically make it when your opponent gets low on life, and they literally basically have pick up scoop, because it's not the easiest card to get rid of, because it cannot be destroyed while it has exceed materials, and if they're gonna, it typically takes resources to get over. It takes effect activations, which is pretty potent. I mean, you'd have to do something like Histel it away, and in the process you're probably going to take a bit of life point damage, unless you're using cards that have summoning conditions such as Photon Thrasher or Hat Tricker. But I find that the card is probably definitely worth playing in any kind of rank 7 base deck. And of course, lastly, one copy of number 11 Big Eye, Mr. Steal Your Girl himself. I still think Big Eye is a pretty potent card. Stealing an opponent's monster, like I said, is always going to be good. I find Big Eye is still a pretty dang good card. You know, you don't... People say it's not as good, and I'm just like, you're stealing an opponent's monster. I mean, maybe a little biased because I got beat by the card so much, but nevertheless, I think Big Eye is an incredibly potent card. So anyway, guys, I'd like to thank you for watching this video today. I really appreciate when you guys watch my videos. You can tune in on Tuesday, Thursday, and Fridays for more Yu-Gi-Oh content. Also, Saturday, the day after this video goes up, I'm going to try to stream that afternoon, because I'm off of work. So I know I've been neglecting you guys in terms of streams. So don't you guys worry. I will be streaming on Saturday afternoon. So I'll probably some Dueling Network. We'll mess around with some decks. But anyway, guys, as always, I'd like to thank you guys for watching. So, Storm.